We are here today because the defendant refused to take responsibility. This negligence cost my client everything.
27 years earlier, a baby was left on his diner's doorstep in the middle of a snowstorm. He never had to keep that baby. He chose to, every single day, for 27 years. That baby grew up to become a lawyer, confidence, and walked straight into this courtroom for his father.
Nobody in that courtroom knew the truth about the man standing beside Robert Hale. The man you're trying to remove from his own land raised a stranger's son with nothing but love and a diner apron.
The son he never had to raise had just given him everything back.
Robert Hale sat at the defense table with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, watching a corporate attorney in an expensive black suit calmly explain to the judge why the diner that had fed 3 generations of truck drivers should legally belong to a company that had never once set foot behind its counter. And beside him stood a young lawyer in a fitted charcoal suit who the entire courtroom assumed was simply hired counsel. And the strange part was, nobody in that room. Not the judge, not the opposing attorney, not even most of Robert's own longtime customers watching from the gallery, had any idea what that young man actually meant to him. Let's go back to where this began. 27 years earlier, on a bitter January night with snow piling up faster than the county plows could clear it, Robert Hale had been locking up Hale's Diner, the small roadside stop off Highway 9 his own father had built with his hands decades before, when he heard something that didn't belong in a snowstorm. A baby crying, faint and shivering, coming from just outside the front door. If you've ever wondered what real family actually means, this story might answer that better than anything I could tell you directly. Robert had found the infant wrapped in a thin quilted blanket, a note tucked into the folds that simply read, "Please take care of him. Can't. I'm sorry." No name, no return address, nothing but a scared, desperate handwriting and a baby boy who couldn't have been more than a few days old. Robert, 31 at the time, unmarried, running a diner that barely broke even most months, could have called the county the next morning and handed the baby over to the system, and no one would have blamed him for it. Instead, he sat in his diner that whole freezing night with the baby wrapped against his chest near the kitchen's warm ovens, and by sunrise, something in him had already decided, quietly and completely, that this child was his to raise, official paperwork or not. It took Robert nearly 2 years navigating a slow, confusing foster-to-adopt legal process, filing every form himself at the kitchen table after closing each night, before Marcus Hale legally became his son on paper, though in every way that mattered, Robert had already claimed him that very first snowy night. Robert raised Marcus behind the counter of Hale's Diner, teaching him to flip pancakes standing on an overturned milk crate before he could see over the griddle, teaching him to count change, to shake a customer's hand and mean it, and most of all, to always tell the truth even when a lie would be easier, a lesson Robert had inherited from his own father and never once let go of. Marcus grew up knowing the full story of how he came to Hale's Diner, because Robert had never once considered hiding it from him, believing a boy deserved the truth about where he came from and the truth about how deeply he was still chosen despite it. When Marcus turned 18, Robert melted down an old diner spoon and had a jeweler shape it into a thin ring, telling his son that the diner had given him everything, and now a piece of it would always be with him wherever he went, a ring Marcus had worn on a chain under his shirt every single day since, through college, through law school, through every case he'd ever taken. If this part of the story is landing with you, tell me, what's something small someone did for you that ended up meaning everything? I read every comment. 3 months before the trial, a letter arrived at Hale's Diner from Whitmore Foods Corporation, a massive restaurant chain expanding aggressively into rural highway corridors, claiming that an obscure decades-old supplier agreement Robert's late father had signed in the 1970s included a long-forgotten land option clause that legally entitled Whitmore Foods to purchase the diner's property at a fraction of its actual value, an option they now intended to exercise. Robert, certain the claim was either a misunderstanding or an outright fabrication, hired an attorney he could barely afford, but as Whitmore's legal team, led by senior corporate attorney Vanessa Cole, buried the case in paperwork and procedural motions Robert had no way of matching. His own attorney eventually admitted the fight was likely unwinnable against a firm with that many resources. It was Marcus, by then 2 years into his career at a mid-sized firm in Nashville, who insisted on stepping in himself, taking a leave from his firm to represent his father personally, despite Robert's protests that his son was too young, too inexperienced, and risking too much of his own career on a case that looked, on paper, thoroughly lost. Marcus spent every night for 6 weeks combing through decades of the diner's old paper records stored in Robert's attic, searching for anything that might undercut Whitmore's claim, until he found something buried in a box of his grandfather's old correspondence. An original, unsigned draft of the 1970s supplier agreement, entirely lacking the land option clause Whitmore's version of the contract now conveniently included, alongside a letter from Robert's father to a family friend mentioning that he'd refused to sign any version of the deal that included such a clause, dated 1 week before the final signed contract Whitmore had submitted to the court. On the day of closing arguments, with Judge Patricia Lynn watching closely from the bench, Vanessa Cole delivered a polished, confident summary insisting the signed contract spoke for itself regardless of any earlier drafts, clicking her pen rapidly as she always did when she sensed a courtroom slipping slightly out of her control. Then it was Marcus's turn to speak, and instead of opening with case law, he set his notes down entirely and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, before I address the contract itself, I need this court to understand something about the man sitting at this table," he said, his voice steady despite the current running beneath it, "because I don't believe you can properly weigh his credibility without knowing who he actually is." He told the courtroom the whole story then, the snowstorm, the note, the 2 years of paperwork filed by hand, the spoon melted into a ring, all of it, watching his father's composed expression finally crack with quiet tears partway through, watching the judge remove her glasses and lean forward, watching even a few members of Whitmore's own legal team shift uncomfortably in their seats. "The man you are trying to remove from his own land," Marcus continued, turning finally to face Vanessa Cole directly, "raised a stranger's son with nothing but a diner apron and absolute honesty, at real cost to himself, expecting nothing in return. That is who wrote the letter I'm about to show this court, refusing, in his own handwriting, to ever sign the very clause your client claims he agreed to." He then presented the original unsigned draft and the letter, walking Judge Lynn through the dated discrepancy between Robert's actual refusal and the conveniently altered final version Whitmore had submitted, evidence that, combined with a forensic document examiner's later testimony confirming inconsistencies in the supposedly decades-old signature page, ultimately proved fatal to Whitmore's entire claim. Judge Lynn ruled from the bench 2 days later, dismissing the case in full, noting for the record that the evidence strongly suggested the land option clause had been fraudulently inserted long after Robert's father's death, and referring the matter for further investigation into Whitmore Foods' legal conduct. Vanessa Cole, for the first time in the entire trial, said nothing at all, simply gathering her files in tight, controlled silence. Outside the courthouse, Robert pulled Marcus into a hug that neither of them let go of for a long moment, Robert finally saying what he'd never quite found the right words for in 27 years. "I didn't save you that night, son. I think maybe it went the other way around." Hale's diner stayed open, busier than ever after local news picked up the story, and Marcus eventually left his Nashville firm to open a small practice of his own back home, close enough to still flip pancakes behind the counter on slow Sunday mornings when his father needed the extra hands. The lesson in all of this is one Robert never had to teach with words, because he simply lived it every day for 27 years. Family was never really about blood in the first place. It was about who chooses to show up and keeps choosing, long after anyone would blame you for walking away. Thank you for spending this time with Robert and Marcus's story. If it moved you, stay a while longer, because there are so many more stories about the families we choose still waiting to be told.